The Vartora this evening relates, as I say, to the importance of gratitude in our lives. Being grateful prevents us from feeling anxious and depressed. I've learned that when I'm grateful, I cannot at the same time feel anxious and depressed, which is a real positive in our lives. It's as simple oftentimes as waking up in the morning and being grateful for living another day. Speaking for myself, I can take for granted just having that ability to live yet another day. And that alone is something that is incredible when we really just think about even that, life itself. It's not about taking the, it's about, I should say, not taking the good in our lives for granted and focusing on what we do have in our lives, not that which we do not have. So I'm grateful for so much and for being here this evening with all of you who I value so much for your time and your interest in participating in this course. So thank you so much. So as I mentioned, I was a practicing attorney for many, many years, from 1986 through 2008. At which time I went to prison for almost 11 years for a white collar crime. And during those years in prison, I assisted many, many inmates on a variety of legal matters, mostly criminal appeals, but also a lot of other types of matters, divorces, bankruptcies, as you can imagine, which strikes many of us when we're in prison, those type of issues. And so I'm pretty well versed in many of the post-conviction appellate remedies and matters that are filed by inmates, as well as post-conviction, post-release legal issues that confront many of us once we release, including barriers to employment, barriers to tenancy, renting an apartment. So any types of questions that you might have relating to any of these type of issues, I'd be very happy to respond to and discuss with all of you. And Michael, you can also put my email address in the chat. That's fine too, if anyone has any questions at a later date that maybe they feel comfortable asking. So,
and if I hear me now?
Yes, perfectly, Alan. Thank you so much.
Great, no problem.
Thank you for being here. So I'm going to introduce you, Alan, and then we can begin.
Okay.
Alan Mills is the executive director of Uptown People's Law Center, a nonprofit community legal clinic located on the north side of Chicago. UPLC is a legal organization that fights for justice for tenants, the disabled, and prisoners in Illinois. He began as a volunteer law student at UPLC in 1979. Alan has tried dozens of individual cases on behalf of prisoners in state and federal court during the last 40 years. UPLC is currently lead counsel in 5 class action cases, alleging that Illinois prisons violate the constitutional rights of Illinois prisoners. These include claims that the medical and mental health care provided to prisoners violates the 8th Amendment prohibition against cruel and unusual treatment, the state's failure to accommodate the communication needs of deaf and hard of hearing prisoners, a claim that hundreds of guards used excessive force during a series of shakedowns, and a case challenging the excessive use of segregation in Illinois prisons. Alan graduated from Northwestern University of Law in 1981. Since 2005, he has served as an adjunct professor there, teaching a seminar on prisons and prisoners' rights. For the last 10 years, he has also helped train attorneys appointed to represent prisoners in civil rights cases by the United States District Courts for the Northern and Southern Districts of Illinois. I'm very pleased and proud to introduce to all of you, Alan Mills. Thank you for being here, Alan.
Thank you. There's actually a 6th one now that you're reading last year's biography.
Okay.
So we have a new one about the conditions at the Northern Reception Center, which is the facility in Illinois where all prisoners go as they first come into the system from the northern half of the state. Which accounts for about 80% of the prisoners.
Okay.
It's very similar to some of our others in the sense that those prisoners are kept in their cells pretty much 24 hours a day. Unfortunately, the place was built, for example, without any yards, without any recreation area, without any dining rooms. and even without any plugs in people's cells. So people can't even have TVs or fans. And originally people were staying there 2-3 days before they get sent off to their permanent, in big quotes, prison. But now people are spending more like 2 to 3 weeks, sometimes several months in those conditions. So in addition, we have discovered there are problems with lead and copper in the water there, as well as in several other prisons throughout the state have some serious water issues, which we're also looking at. I think I know that your overall theme here has a lot to do with coming out of prison. So I did want to talk about 2 new initiatives we've gotten involved in recently. And the reason I talk about these is because I know that getting out of prison is hard for anybody, and particularly for people who have a disability, which may first arise in prison after people have spent there so long, or they may have come into prison with a disability. So 2 of our new initiatives are to, many of these people are eligible for Social Security when they get out because they're disabled to the extent that they can't actually work. The problem is when typically people can't apply for Social Security until after they're released. So we have what we call an in-reach project to try to identify people within sort of 6 months of when they're leaving in order to start that application process. It usually takes 6 months to a year to actually qualify. And of course, if you don't start until you're out, then what are you supposed to do for that first 6 months that you're out? By definition, you can't work. And not everybody has family who's willing to put them up for that first 6 months. So our hope is we can actually get some people a source of income in place before they walk out of the prison door. Relatedly, lots of halfway houses have rules that actually discriminate against people who are disabled. And that can be anything from simply having stairs, for example, without a ramp. Many of our halfway houses are built that way. And even worse, most of the halfway houses have policies saying that you can't be on any sort of psychological or mental health drugs while you're there. It's intended to keep away illegal drugs, but they also apply it to legal drugs. And what that means is that prisoners often have to make a choice whether they're going to stay in prison because they got nowhere else to go other than the halfway house, or stop taking their psych medication. And sometimes that what looks like psych medication is actually for other things. So what really got me into this case is 2 different clients we had who got out, stopped taking what were not prescribed for psych problems, but were actually prescribed for seizures. So they had to stop taking that medicine in order to get a halfway house placement. Unsurprisingly, once they got in the halfway house, they started having seizures, at which point the halfway house says, your medical problems are way too difficult for us. We can't have you here. And they therefore violated them and sent them back to prison. So a house that would take them when they were taking the medicine they need in order to stay out. It's a catch-22. And it also clearly violates the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. So we have a project to try to break down all of those barriers that there may be to people who are coming out of prison, so that they're not just stuck in prison solely because they are disabled, which unfortunately there are many people to do so. The third thing we're doing is there's a bill in Illinois. Illinois is one of the few states that doesn't have a parole system. So I'm in the car right now and I'm coming back from Springfield. One of the reasons I was there was to talk to legislators about a bill that's been kicking around the legislature for a while, which would make eligible for parole anybody who had served at least 25 years and was at least 55 years old. So there's long-term prisoners who at this point are beginning to deteriorate in their health or may have already deteriorated in health. And it's not an automatic release. It's not like you get out necessarily, but it gives you an opportunity to go before the parole board, which Illinois does not have such a system now. Right now, the only way such people can get out is through clemency, asking the governor to pardon them or shorten their sentence. And that's not a very efficient way to do that. As I'm sure you're aware, governor's under all kinds of pressure in every state not to use his pardon power or clemency power in the way that it was originally designed as really a tool for mercy. Instead, it's become almost a substitute. You have to prove you're innocent or get really lucky And most governors are not using their powers anywhere near as often as they could because they face political blowback. We saw that in Illinois in our last election, where some pretty mild criminal justice reforms became the issue in the governor's race, as well as in a bunch of legislative races. The good news is that all of those people who tried to run on the governor being soft on crime, or legislators being soft on crime by initiating those reforms, they all lost. So nobody actually paid a price for voting for it, but I think it scared a lot of people. So that's my main focus these days, is trying to improve the care that people get in prison so they're not so damaged when they come out. And that certainly includes medical care. And part of the reason to get rid of some of these elder prisoners out of the system is that they take up far too much of the medical resources that we do have. As inadequate as they are in not just Illinois, but any prison system in the country, I'm not aware of a single one that does a really good job providing medical care to prisoners. Why? Because prisons are built not for 50-year-olds. They were all built for 25-year-olds. But now, because of truth in sentencing and the long sentences that have been out there, it means that increasingly the number of people in prison who are 55, 50, 60, I think there's one 80-year-old in prison here in Illinois, and I know nationwide there are many. There's just no reason to keep those folks in prison anymore. Prisons make terrible nursing homes, and they're never designed that way, and they shouldn't become good nursing homes. People who need to be in a nursing home should be in a nursing home, not inside a prison. And of course, they take up vastly more disproportionate amounts of the medical care, leaving everybody else with even less medical care than they already have. Same with mental health care. Mental health care is abysmal throughout the prison system. The lockdowns that we've had during COVID over the last now over 3 years have meant that a lot of people spent way too much time in their cells, didn't get mental health treatment, despite the fact that COVID is pretty much under control out here in society. Nobody's really going back to a lot of in-person and out of cell time inside the prisons. They're using COVID as an excuse to keep people continually locked in their cells. So I think that we are seeing, for the first time in a long time, some actual debate about whether or not the prison system is bigger than it needs to be. Some actual debate about how we can reduce the number of people in prison. Some actual debate about things like legalizing marijuana, which was always a driver of at least arrests. Not too many people are actually in prison for marijuana. As John Paff, one of our criminologist heroes, has written a book and done some studies saying that we could let out every single person in prison who's there for drugs, and the United States would still have the highest incarceration rate in the entire world. So I don't want to pretend that drugs are the only reason that we have so many people in prison, but it is certainly a driver, and it's certainly something that everybody always raises as a boogeyman, that, oh my God, we'll have all these addicts running around the street if we don't cut down a number of prisoners. And I want to be clear, the United States does have the highest percentage of prisoners of its population in prison, but also of any country in the entire world, in the history of the world, but also the actual number of prisoners in prison is highest in the United States than anywhere else in the world, including places like Russia, South Africa, when apartheid was in fully developed. So all those things did not end up with nearly as much incarceration as we have here in the United States today. I'm playing my little part, trying to do litigation, but I want to be clear that I don't think litigation alone is ever going to solve this problem. The courts are not going to lead the way towards mass incarceration or elimination of mass incarceration. At best, what I'm doing, I think of as trying to reduce some of the harm that people are experiencing. As long as we continue to lock people up, we have to take care of them. But I think ultimately the goal has to be, loved ones on the outside, people who have been released on the outside, and just generally people who care, taking up this cause and fighting in any way they can in order to reduce the number of people in prison. I spent a lot of time with seriously mental ill people in prison because of our class action lawsuit, and I've become firmly convinced that you can't fix the mental health care system in prison, because the only real solution, um, prisons are toxic to mental health. So the only way to actually get somebody good treatment for mental health care in prison is send them home. As long as they're in prison, they're going to continue to be abused and continue to get worse. One of our experts, Terry Coopers, who's a nationally recognized expert on solitary and a psychiatrist, he always, when he talks about this kind of thing, he says, you could have your favorite therapist provide 5 hours of therapy per week, which would be far more than anybody gets in the Department of Corrections, more like 1 hour or half an hour a month. But nonetheless, people would get worse because the other 23 hours a day, people would be in hell. And therefore, it doesn't really matter how good the treatment is for that hour that you get some mental health treatment. The negatives that go with it just overwhelm the system. I know that there's some litigation being done. And I think you have the lawyer who's doing this litigation about lifetime sex registries and people who are in prison just because they can't find a place. I think the lawyers who are doing that has already come or is coming to talk to you. Is that right?
Yes, in one of the next sessions, correct.
All right, so I won't talk about that case. I'll let him talk about his own case. I don't need to finish that for him. Again, I'd like to answer some questions. I'd like to hear what people have to say on the call here. And I can talk forever about prisons, but I'm really interested in seeing what people on the call want to talk about and what their concerns are. So at this time, I want to sort of throw it open for questions, unless, David, there's something you think I should cover that I haven't done.
No, I think that's great, Alan. I thought the one comment I was going to make is I know that you've worked on some different class action cases through the years. Is there anything ongoing now that you think might be of interest to the attendees tonight in particular, or possibly?
Yeah, I mean, sadly, all of the cases you listed are still going on. We are almost done with the excuse me, failure to accommodate deaf and hard of prison hearing prisoners. We're down to the one last issue, which is while they're now providing ASL interpreters for some deaf prisoners for some interactions, there's still far too many really important things that happen where they don't get sign language interpreters. So, for example, not all medical appointments do you have sign language interpreters. Not all disciplinary reports do you have sign language interpreters. So we're still fighting about that one last piece. But the good news is they have vastly increased the number of people they're giving hearing aids to, which is a big deal. I mean, you can imagine being in prison is bad enough all by itself, but if you can't hear what's going on around you, it's a really terrifying place. You really never know what's happening around you. So in Illinois, they used to have a one hearing aid per person rule. You would only get one, because why do you need 2 ears in prison? You just need to hear out of one ear. That was not constitutional, and that is no longer the rule in Illinois. And they used to not send people out to audiologists really to get tested to make sure that they had, their hearing was appropriate. Now everybody who reports a hearing loss does get evaluated and gets whatever sorts of accommodation they need. It may just be that you have to be in a quiet place when you're having a serious conversation with somebody. It can't be on the tier where there's lots of yelling going on and it's much harder to hear. But it could also be everything up to a sign language interpreter, hearing aids, whatever people need, they're now supposed to get. It's been a big fight about like televisions, where you have to turn on the closed captioning, for example. We've got that in place now. None of that used to happen at all. So we've had many successes, but that one's still outstanding. The case about mental health care is very much still alive. Unfortunately, we've talked to people at Dixon Correctional Center, which is where they put some of our most seriously mental ill people here in Illinois. We talked to prisoners who have had no group therapy, no individual counseling since last July. And the only psychiatric care they get is a psychiatrist comes by once a month and yells at them through a closed solid steel door, asking them how they're doing with their meds. And that lasts maybe 5 minutes at best. So that's the only treatment that we're giving right now to some of the most seriously mental ill people in the entire system. So that case is very much still going on. In our medical care case, we finally have a plan, and this was settled 4 years ago. And the first thing that was supposed to happen was the department was supposed to come up with a plan as to how they're going to fix the system. Our settlement has some very broad goals, but it needs very specific steps to get there. And it was only 2 weeks ago that the judge entered an order finally adopting an implementation plan because the defendants just couldn't come up with one. And in fact, several months ago, were held in contempt of court by the judge because they did not have a plan. So they're very far behind. And just my favorite example is most of the world is using electronic medical records now. The Department of Corrections still is not doing so. Even under the settlement agreement, they're supposed to have that fully in place last September. And even that was far too long. Now they put it out for bid, and then they didn't accept any of the bids. So they're starting all over again. So right now it's not even out for bids, let alone it'll probably be 1.5 years after they actually get a vendor before they have electronic medical records. So medical records are still handwritten, are still randomly filed. There's no system for it. And what that means is doctors don't look at the records to see what's going on. They treat like every single interaction with a prisoner as a brand new interaction, as if they'd never seen it before. And no doctor works like that. It never happens like that. You would never do that. When you go to your doctor, they have your file, they have you generally on a computer, and they look at it and they say, okay, last time you're here were your test results. Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? Et cetera, et cetera. None of that happens in the Department of Corrections. They pretend like you've never seen it before. So that means that people's health can deteriorate over and over again. Unfortunately, the federal court monitor in that case came out with a report last June, which talked about some real horror stories of people who are elderly, suffering from dementia, terminally ill, or otherwise mobility impaired, people left in their wheelchairs, just sitting for a whole day, generally sitting in their own waste, because nobody's there to help them get up. People have broke bones because there's nobody to help them get out of bed to go to the toilet, and therefore they get out of bed and they fall. There are some loose and missing tiles on the floor where there's a lot of people in walkers. So a lot of those folks end up tripping on those loose tiles. It's not an ADA compliant area at all. And at nighttime, perhaps the worst of it is on the 3rd floor, and it's on the 3rd floor, and often the elevator is broken. So there have been occasions where an ambulance is called for somebody's having a medical emergency on the 3rd floor and the elevator is broken. So guards have to carry the person downstairs in order to put them in the ambulance, which is just absurd. But overnight, generally, there's no medical personnel on that 3rd floor at all. There's one guard who's responsible for 66 people, and that guard is supposed to, first of all, keep an eye on them all night, and then a guard without any medical training is responsible for determining whether somebody's having a medical crisis, and then calling downstairs for somebody to come up when the guard decides there is a medical crisis. So again, our medical case is very much going ahead. Even though we have a settlement, I won't say that we've anywhere near solved our medical care problems. Our solitary case continues. While Jeffries, who was the director or is the director in Illinois, he just announced his retirement that he was leaving yesterday, but he's there until the end of this month. He's put in some new policies on paper, which reduce the number of people in solitary and certainly allow for them to get more out of cell time when they're in solitary. But most of that has not trickled down to what actually happens at cell front. As anybody who's had any experience knows, what's written on paper at the director level often has very little to do with what actually happens at cell front. Guards just don't always do what the policies say. They're often ignored and violated. So people are still spending 24 hours a day in their cells with nothing to do. I think the longest term person in Illinois has been in solitary for 30 some years. Under international law, the Mandela standards, 15 days is considered the maximum after which it's considered torture. Illinois is not 15 days. It's not anywhere near 15 days. It's not 15 weeks. It's not 15 months. Many people have spent 15 years in those kinds of severe isolation. So again, All those cases are ongoing. All those cases are still being fought out. None of them has been solved. I guess I should talk about one victory on the federal level. In the northwest corner of Illinois is Thompson Prison, which was not quite a supermax prison, but close to it. They transferred a lot of the people who were at Allenwood in Pennsylvania there as they repurposed Allenwood. So it was one of the highest security units in the country. And there had been a series of deaths, a series of reports of very serious brutality, retaliation for talking to lawyers, people strapped in chairs, and then in 4-point restraints and restraint chairs, and then beaten after they're in restraint chairs. People being interrogated after they talk to their lawyers. And if they don't tell the guards what they told the lawyers, they're thrown in solitary. The good news is they closed that unit. 2 weeks ago, they announced they closed the unit. I don't know that everybody's been transferred, but they announced that before we could file our lawsuit, we'd gone out and interviewed hundreds of people there and were ready to file, but before we actually could file it, they closed it. So declare victory temporarily. Now, of course, the question is, where are they going to move them to? Are they just going to recreate the same system in a different state? Or have they actually learned their lesson? And there's a new director of the Bureau of Prisons appointed by Biden, who's recently started. Hopefully that means that they're not just going to do the same thing again somewhere else. Hopefully the reason they closed it is because of the pressure that was brought by us. And I don't want to say we were the only lawyers on it. It was a whole team of lawyers. But we'll see. We'll see what the future brings. Things can always be just move somewhere else. Sometimes I feel like I'm playing whack-a-mole. You solve one problem in one place and it just pops up somewhere else. So we're tracking where they send those guys to and trying to figure out what's going on once they move. So that's a very long answer to your short question. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Alan. And I think Alan makes a good point. If any of you have any questions, having heard his talk, and if you have any specific questions, he'd be very happy to field those.
Or just want to share what's going on with you or your loved ones or anybody else who's connected to the prison system.
Yes.
I just want to see, Carlene or Michael, can you look at who has their hands raised and call upon them? Right. Okay, I'll start. Isaac Yampolsky.
Please, Isaac.
Unmute yourself.
Hey y'all, glad to be here. I'm not showing up to myself, but I hope y'all can hear me.
Yep.
I am honored to be here with you, Mr. Mills. I've heard about your work at Uptown People's Law Center, and I think it's incredible what y'all are doing. My
Thank you.
question concerns post-release supervision, or just supervision in general. I did a probation term on sex offender probation. I'm on the sex offender registry. That's a whole nother thing. But I have talked to many people, both sex offenders, regular parolees, and heard so many horror stories about asinine and dangerous and impossible conditions. My words may be softened a little bit, but conditions of release and supervision. And I know that I think it's like a majority of prison admissions in Illinois every year are for parole violations. So
It's about a third. It's about a third.
Oh, it's a third here. I think I was reading in another state. I think in Minnesota, it's like 66%, 64%, something like that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. So, does UPLC do work in that area, or have you heard of any litigation, any sort of work being done by anyone anywhere in Illinois to address or to at least look at conditions of release?
Yeah. So a couple things have been going on and some have actually happened. Several years ago, pre-COVID, we filed a case along with the MacArthur Justice Center about the process used to revoke people's parole. The United States Supreme Court decided about 45 years ago that people who could not reasonably defend themselves at a parole violation hearing were entitled to lawyers. In the intervening 40 some years, Illinois had never appointed a lawyer to represent anybody at a parole revocation hearing. They just ignored the Supreme Court. So we sued, and they've now set up a system where there are lawyers, at least in theory, who can be appointed to those people who can't represent themselves. When I say in theory, we actually had two suits, one on behalf of the juvenile prison system and one for the adult system. The juvenile system is working really well. All juveniles faced with a parole revocation now, they use a different term for it, but it's the same thing. Now all of them now get lawyers. There's no discretion. They all get lawyers. So that's a huge step forward. And as a result, the number of people who are going back to prison as juveniles have plummeted, which is part of the reason that the Illinois juvenile population in their juvenile prison population has cratered. We used to have, I think, 7 institutions. They're down to like 2.5. And there's a real movement to close the rest of them because they're really not needed at all. On the adult side, it's not working so well. And of course, the scale is very different. There were like 300 revocation hearings for the juveniles when we brought our case. There are more like 30,000 for the adults every year. Yeah, right, exactly. So you can imagine getting lawyers for 30,000 people is very different than getting lawyers for 300 people. And unfortunately, the Department of Correction or the Prison Review Board screens most people out and decides they don't actually need lawyers. So we may have a second round of litigation going on. On the legislative side, there's a bill pending right now in front of the legislature, which would prohibit sending people back to prison for parole violations that don't constitute a new crime. So there could be all kinds of other sanctions still, including electronic monitoring, but they can't send people back. They couldn't, if this bill passes, send people back to prison anymore for violating, as you said, what are often just absurd conditions. The final piece that's out there is trying to, and I don't know that this is cut into a piece of legislation yet, but I know there's a growing movement to cut down on the number of people on electronic monitoring while they're on parole or what Illinois calls mandatory supervision. Because that is a huge restraint in terms of your ability to get a job, your ability to do anything. There have been some really terrible cases of moms whose kids have gotten sick and desperately need to go to the hospital or injured, and they had to choose whether or not they're going to violate their parole by taking their kid to the hospital or let their kids suffer. And of course, moms in general have just gone to the hospital, said, "Oh, that if I have to go back to prison, I'm going back to prison. I'm going to take care of my kid." But nobody should be forced to make that choice of going back to prison or taking your kid to the emergency room. And unfortunately, that is the current situation. So there's been some real, I think, grassroots agitation to try to get rid of some of this electronic monitoring and reserve it for people who actually have some danger, and certainly to limit the amount of time that people are on. Unfortunately, electronic monitoring go on for months and months and months. And my position is, and a lot of people's position is, that if somebody shows that they're doing all the things they're supposed to do in the first month or so, then the parole should stop bothering them and essentially let them lead their lives and only get back involved again when there's a problem. There's enough people who don't adjust while being on the outside, and that's where those parole agents should be concentrating their resources. And that way they could spend more time helping people rather than just being a police force and violating people.
All right, let's hear from Mark.
I'm sorry, one more thing. And then nationally, really building off the case that we did with the MacArthur Justice Center, they have now started a national project to try to deal with some of these parole revocation problems that are going on. As you noted, Illinois is not the worst state by any means. So they're trying to work in multiple states, trying to make this into a national movement to try to stop so many people going back to prison because of these ridiculous parole restrictions. I'm sorry, I cut you off.
You're
The answer is yes. All arrests without convictions can be expunged. Every state is different. So it's a state question. But in Illinois, the answer is definitely yes. We've worked very hard to expand the expungement and sealing rules so that any arrest, though, there's some crimes that can be arrested, even convictions can be either sealed or expunged. But definitely all arrests without convictions are absolutely can be expunged. You did ask a second half of your question, though, can it negatively impact your employment and housing, I would add. The Illinois Human Rights Act statewide prohibits discrimination in employment based on arrests, not convictions, but on arrests. In Cook County, even convictions can't be used to discriminate in housing. And that's a project that we've started, which I didn't talk about, is trying to enforce that law. So they can't look at they can't ever look at arrests. They can't look at convictions that are more than 3 years old. And for more recent convictions, they have to do a individualized assessment, going through some very specific procedural steps in order to determine whether or not the conviction actually endangers people in the building or not. So in general, though, arrests can't ever be used on housing or employment discrimination here in Illinois. Other states, again, are different. I know that the federal EEOC is working on and has some guidance out there suggesting that using just arrests without a conviction constitutes racial discrimination and therefore is illegal. I don't know if that's just a policy yet or if it's been put into law. I don't do that work federally. I'm working here in Illinois.
Okay, thank you.
But it shouldn't be. Arrest should never, ever be used because all it means is a cop decided you think you did something wrong. No judge has ever decided you, in fact, did something wrong.
Right.
So really, arrests should never be used against anybody.
Thank you.
Beyond my level of expertise, what I will say is there's always the option of a presidential pardon. So somebody should be starting that process for him, which is separate from compassionate release. Obviously, the president can let anybody out anytime for any reason that he chooses to do so. So that process doesn't require any minimum amount of time in prison. Because of COVID, they did start a compassionate release program. I know it exists. I don't know any of the details about it. You'd really have to do generally, I think my vague understanding, and I'm speaking outside of my expertise here, but my vague understanding is that ends up going back before or at least can go back before the federal judge who did the sentencing in the first place. So I don't know if there's an internal way they can do it without going back before that judge. I know that here in Illinois, there have been a couple of cases where it did go back to the judge and the judge did let people out. But I don't know enough about those mechanisms. You really need somebody who practices criminal law in the federal courts as the person who would know that stuff. One place you might look is Families Against Mandatory Minimums, which has an office in California. Work with federal sentencing, so they may know more than I do, and if they don't know, yes, thank you for putting that up. Again, I don't do federal criminal law at all, so I'm outside my expertise. I know sort of what I have picked up through the grapevine, but I've never studied it.
Thank you.
So there is a golden ticket, but if you force me to choose one thing, it's strong family support throughout the time that they're in prison. Coming out is just really, really hard. And if you don't have family support, I know there are people who manage to make it, but I have no idea how they make it coming home without a strong family support or at least some sort of social network support. It's just nothing that anybody should try to do on their own. So that's my simplistic answer. The other answer I always give is shorten sentences. The less time people have inside, the more likely they are to be able to get out and make it on the outside.
Thank you.
damages. I mean, we just tried a case on behalf of somebody tragically who started off with a counterfeit paperclip that he'd hidden in his shoe. So rather than taking the paperclip, they took his shoes. He was a type 1 diabetic. Ended up with blisters on his feet because they gave him crappy shoes instead of the good shoes he had. That blister got worse and worse because they gave him terrible medical care. Then they refused to accept the doctors, finding that he should be on a low gallery, so he didn't have to walk him downstairs. Instead, they put him up on the 3rd floor. His infection got worse. They didn't treat it, and ultimately got his leg amputated below the knee, all for a paperclip. So we just tried that case and got a $400,000 verdict on behalf of him against various individuals. So yes, you can certainly sue for money. The question, but your second question was, the last 50 years have shown that states are willing to spend a lot of money to lock people up. And frankly, Illinois Department of Corrections annual budget is about $1.5 billion. So my $400,000 is a lot for my guy. Obviously, he has no money at all. So $400,000, that's him put his grandchildren through college, which is what he really wanted to get out of that lawsuit, because he's serving a life sentence. But it's not going to have a material impact on the department's overall budget. $400,000 is like a rounding error when your entire budget is $1.5 billion. And I think that has been shown nationwide, is that individual damages suits to change. That's my feeling. I mean, I still do them because I think it's important to get justice for individuals who are harmed. So about half of our time is spent on individual cases and half of it is spent on these class action cases. There's so many terrible medical stories out there that it became overwhelming to us to try to figure out which ones we could pursue. And all of them are quite time consuming. It took like 5 years to bring this case I just described where a man lost his leg. So we've just decided to spend more of our time on class action cases, trying to change the entire system rather than trying to use money as a lever to fix the system. Maybe I'm a pessimist. I know there are other lawyers who disagree with me and think that bringing damages cases is the only thing that's worthwhile doing, and that these big class action cases are a waste of time. I've done both, and I mean, my bottom line is neither one of them work very well, which is why I said earlier that I think, grassroots mobilizing and the power of the people is ultimately the solution here. But I personally believe class actions are a more effective way to bring about change than individual. The case, I mean, the one I just described about the leg we had 2 different doctors, a nurse, the warden who assigned him to the upper tier. So we had a whole bunch of defendants, as well as the Department of Corrections itself was a defendant. But that I know of, the state ends up indemnifying any individual who gets sued. So it's never coming out of their pockets. It's coming out of the taxpayer money. Leave that to the religious folks in the room as to whether that constitutes justice or an escape. But the bottom line is they don't pay. So, going after doctors' licenses has been sort of a dream. But I don't know that and not all states, by the way, require those doctors to be licensed. There have been, I know, lots of cases in other states, not Illinois, where doctors who have lost their licenses go work in the prison system because they're exempt from the licensing requirements. So, I'm in favor of using all pressure points you can think of. The main beneficiaries actually aren't companies at all. So I know a lot of people are really down on private prison companies, and as am I. They're terrible things. They're terrible places. They shouldn't exist. I've always said locking people up should be difficult and expensive. It should never be anybody's profit center at all. But they're a tiny portion of the overall budget that we spend. By far, the biggest people by far the largest group that benefits from this system is guards. The guard unions and the individual guard employees take up about half of the dollars that we spend on the criminal justice system in general, including if you include the police and the whole system from the time of arrest through parole. It's police and prison guards that get the vast bulk of it, which is why the unions are in many states are leading the charge to try to expand it. It's often the guards unions, not the private prison companies, that are really the ones pushing against any sort of meaningful reform that would reduce the number of people in prison. In contrast, private prison profiteering accounts for somewhere around 1 or 2% of the total that we spend on locking people up. So they're terrible, but they are not the problem. A couple of states, including Connecticut, and I know there's one other one, maybe two other ones, have actually set up their own nursing homes to solve this problem. Illinois had talked about it, but never actually did it. But that's only a handful of beds that are available in the entire country for this. I mean, it's one of the most upsetting parts and one of the most absurd parts of our irrational is that we continue to punish them long past the time that they've served their sentences, long past the time that they're any danger to anybody. And the example you give, people are elderly, needs to be in a nursing home. They're not a danger to anybody. Nonetheless, we have these absurd rules where nursing homes won't take them, etc. There's no good answer because it's a disgusting, useless system. About that. So, I mean, the bottom line is polygraphs in and of themselves for anyone are pretty useless. They're not much better than flipping coins. And some people would say they're worse than flipping coins. I think for somebody who's neurodivergent, they're absolutely useless. And I know NAMI has done some work on this, on particularly the particular issues of autistic people who are caught up in the criminal justice system. Unfortunately, there's the people with autism and TBI both separately are vastly disproportionately in prison compared to the general population. It in a warped sort of way makes sense. Autistic people don't do really well at either changes or commands. They don't always respond like everybody else does, and certainly to people touching them and all those kinds of things. So there's lots and lots of cases where people who are autistic end up in big disputes with the police and end up getting arrested, not for something they were doing, but to the reaction to a police officer who comes and starts giving them orders and they don't follow them. And then they end up in prison for resisting arrest, or worse yet, getting into a fight with a police officer, even though there's no underlying crime. And it's purely a result of their autism that they end up in prison. It's disgusting. Our society, and autism is a particular problem, but it's not the only one. People with mental illness in general are vastly overrepresented. And I know autism is not mental illness, so I want to be clear that they're not the same. But people who are neurodivergent is perhaps a larger category, end up in prison vastly disproportionate. And it's frankly because we have this huge gap between what we use as the insanity defense and people who are seriously mentally ill and actually are committing their crimes as a symptom of their mental illness. Those people don't belong in prison at all. They belong in a treatment center. They just don't. And prison is not a place for those folks. There's absolutely no reason for sending people like that. Punishing somebody who was symptomatic makes no more sense than locking your kid in a room because they have a fever. We don't punish people for having fevers. We treat the fever, but we don't do that with people who are neurodivergent. We treat that as if it was a criminal act, and we punish them for the symptoms of their illness. And it's just it's disgusting. I have no better term for it. The problem is that state regulations are not enforceable in federal courts. You end up in a state court somewhere. And the second problem, and I know this is a huge problem in Illinois, is that most of the policies are internal policies to the Department of Corrections and are not enforceable by prisoners or parolees. So we litigated one of these cases unsuccessfully, where a man was sent to solitary and had a year of good time revoked based on a disciplinary report, and they violated all of their own rules in terms of the kind of notice they had to give, whether they had to turn over exculpatory evidence, and whether or not an interested party could sit on the adjustment committee. And he proved all of those. And ultimately, the Illinois Supreme Court said, well, yeah, all those are violations of the rules, but the rules are just for the internal guidance of the Department of Corrections. They were never meant to be enforceable by prisoners. And therefore, yes, all those things were done wrong, but we don't care. And therefore, you lose your case. And unfortunately, that's true with a lot of operating policies that are supposed to apply to corrections. They're not enforceable by prisoners. The courts are loath to hold prison officials accountable for anything. And it's one of the it's a failing of my profession. I've certainly tried to enforce some of those policies through court and have never gotten very far. Trying.
I have, I guess, a comment and two comments. Number one is that we are organizing an event to look at the decriminalization of mental health and to advocate for it with multiple partners, including NAMI.
Good.
On 28th. We're hoping to bring some of these issues, what I call break the cycle, because we deal so much with mental health issues and it's really appalling. So I'd like people to know about that. And it's a way to inform others who don't know about it. People just don't know about how when mental health institutions were torn apart in the 80s, maybe justifiably so, that prisons have become now the mental health institutions in Illinois. And they can't everywhere, and they're not qualified to do it. Something positive that I feel that there is some change, and now is a good time to advocate, because many places are putting in alternatives to calling the police for bipolar, schizophrenia. They're finding alternatives to deal with these issues that don't involve either bringing them to the emergency room or to police. And I think it's a very good point, a good place to advocate. I do see anecdotally a relationship with sex offenses. Just
No, we're losing you.
We've lost Abby for the moment.
She'll be back. She's gonna jump in at triple speed, Mr. Moses, but oh, here she's back now. Okay.
Did I freeze?
You froze. Yep.
I never froze the whole time. Where did I get cut off?
Just as you're saying, it's a good way to spread the word about mental health and prison.
Oh, right. So I said
criminal justice.
anecdotally, I see a lot of relationship between autism and the sex offender registry. And we have a lot, but I can't say, but I think bipolar and schizophrenia, it's clear that there is a relationship. And I think the tide is changing with mental health and incarceration. And I encourage people to speak out to their people, because people are recognizing this as an issue. Although I do have to say, when I advocate for this event, people who deal with mental health, even though 75% of them deal with the criminal justice system, don't want to admit that mental health is associated with criminal justice. So for whatever reason. So I sorry to put that in, but think May 28th.
I would also add, I mean, it's important to recognize that while people with a mental illness are vastly overrepresented in the prison system, it's also true that people who have a mental illness are not particularly overrepresented in who commits crimes, and that people who with a mental illness are much more likely to be victims of crimes than they are to be people who commit crimes. So I know it's often hard to separate those two things. It's not that people who are suffering from mental illness commit more crimes, it's they are criminalized more. And I think that's why many mental health folks, not NAMI, but a lot of other mental health organizations, don't want to touch the criminal justice system, because every time some horrible crime makes the news, the first thing that people say is, well, that person must be mentally ill. So there's a real stigma that mental illness causes criminal behavior, and that's just not true. It causes incarceration. It doesn't cause criminal behavior. I know that's a message I've struggled with a lot of groups to get across. Some people get it and some people don't.
Any other questions? For Mr. Mills?
Only possible. The question is finding the right employer. I won't say that the legal system or the lawyers in general are any better about non-discrimination than anybody else in the world is. But I know that there are lawyers who have employed people who used to be who were on the registry and had a sex offense. So it's possible. I won't say it's going to be easy, but it's possible. Yes.
Your own paralegal practice, if you'd like.
Hard way to make a living, but yes, in theory, it's possible.
Very true.
David, I think it's almost 8:30. Did you want to close up and?
Well, I want to actually thank Alan so much. Calling from his car and giving us this kind of time while he's out of town is just, again, a testament to his dedication, not only to agreeing on repeated occasions over the years to assist us at the Hinda Institute, but just, as you can see, his passion for what he does. It's just tremendous. And Alan, thank you so much for that.
You're welcome. The plan was not to do it for my car. Springfield just went a lot longer than it was supposed to today. So I thought I was going to make it back in time, but I didn't quite. So, but nonetheless, it's always great experience coming here. People in the Hinda Institute always have good questions to ask and good stories to share. So I'm thrilled to do this.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Alan, I'd like to also say that if there are bills you're working on, Nancy sent me one, and they're valuable, we'll blast them out.
Okay. I will
Um,
send you some.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, well, we also look forward to seeing all of you next week, same time. We have two very, very qualified and interesting speakers on mental health issues in the law. And one in particular, as Alan alluded to earlier, who's involved in registration, litigation, and issues relating to registration issues. And I think for those of you who can attend for both of these speakers, I think you'll find it to be very illuminating. But thank you so much, everyone, for attending this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you,
so much.
David.
Thank you so much.
David and Michael and Carleen. Great
Thank
job.
you,
so much,
Carleen and
everybody.
Michael, so much.
Thank you.